It was a busy afternoon near one of the most famous landmarks in the city. Tourists from all over the world walked around, taking pictures and chatting with their friends. In the midst of all the excitement stood a royal guardsman, dressed in his traditional uniform with his tall black hat, standing absolutely still. His face was calm, and his posture was perfect. He was known for his discipline, and nothing could distract him from his duty. The air was filled with the sounds of the city, the laughter of children, the chatter of tourists, and the constant hum of traffic. But the guardsman was unmoved, his eyes staring straight ahead. Not far from him, an American bully, a large and muscular dog, walked confidently with its owner. The dog's powerful build and tough appearance seemed to draw attention as it moved along the street. People couldn't help but notice how strong and intimidating the dog looked. Its broad shoulders, muscular frame, and short coat gave off an air of strength and dominance. The owner, a man in his mid-30s, walked beside the dog, tugging gently on the leash every now and then. He looked a bit nervous, as if he knew his dog might cause trouble, but he did his best to remain calm. As the dog walked closer to the royal guardsman, it began to grow uneasy. Something about the stiff, unblinking figure of the guardsman seemed to set the dog on edge. The dog's ears perked up, and its tail started to wag aggressively. The owner noticed the change in the dog's behavior and tried to tug the leash to keep the animal in check, but it was already too late. The dog, driven by instinct and irritation, charged forward without warning, its growl echoing through the street. The royal guardsman, despite his stoic appearance, was caught off guard. The dog's sudden movement was a shock, but in a split second, the guardsman gathered himself. He quickly tried to step aside, but the dog's speed and strength were too much. The dog crashed into him with a force that knocked the guardsman back a few steps. He struggled to maintain his balance, but somehow managed to keep his composure. His eyes never left the dog as he took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation. The tourists around them gasped, unsure of what would happen next. Some of them pulled out their phones to record the incident, while others stood frozen, watching in disbelief. The royal guardsman didn't flinch, though. His years of training were evident in the way he held himself, even when faced with the unexpected. His gaze remained focused, and his posture, although slightly disturbed, remained firm. The dog, still growling, circled around the guardsman, barking loudly. It was clear the animal was agitated, but the guardsman showed no fear. He stood there, unwavering, his eyes locked on the dog, waiting for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, the dog's owner, who had been trying to calm the situation, looked increasingly nervous. He tugged on the leash harder, but the dog was relentless. This was the beginning of a strange and unexpected encounter, a moment that would soon take a turn no one could have predicted. The crowd around them continued to watch, some people now murmuring amongst themselves, unsure whether to intervene or just let the situation unfold. But all eyes were on the guardsman and the dog, who now stood facing each other. One, a symbol of calm discipline, and the other, a powerful force of nature. What would happen next? The situation grew tense as the dog continued to circle around the royal guardsman, barking loudly and snapping its jaws in frustration. The guardsman, though clearly caught off guard by the dog's sudden aggression, remained calm. His posture was unwavering, his eyes never leaving the dog as it prowled around him. He was trained to handle pressure, to stay still, no matter what happened around him. But even he couldn't have predicted this unexpected challenge. The dog's owner was frantic now, struggling to control the animal that had clearly lost its composure. The man tried pulling on the leash, his hand shaking as he attempted to regain control. "Calm down, boy," he muttered, his voice strained, but the dog seemed to grow more restless. It let out another loud bark and lunged forward, coming closer to the guardsman. The guardsman instinctively took a step back, but still stood his ground. His face showed no emotion. His training told him not to react, to remain silent, and still, no matter how chaotic things got. The tourists, who had been snapping photos earlier, now watched with wide eyes, some gasping at the intensity of the scene unfolding before them. The dog's growls filled the air as it approached the guardsman again, this time more aggressively. Its body tensed, ready to strike, but the guardsman didn't flinch. Instead, he carefully adjusted his stance, making sure he was in a position where he could move if necessary, but he didn't want to provoke the dog. The owner was in full panic mode now, his hands gripping the leash so tightly his knuckles turned white. He called out to the dog, his voice high-pitched, trying everything he could think of to calm it down. "Stop it, please," he begged, his eyes darting nervously between the dog and the guardsman. But the dog was beyond control. It let out another growl and lunged again, this time brushing past the guardsman. The guardsman barely flinched, but the force of the dog's movement made him take a small step backward. For the first time, a tiny crack appeared in his unshakable composure. The crowd around them gasped at the sight. Some people were beginning to feel nervous, unsure whether they should step in and help or just wait for things to calm down. But the guardsman didn't look to anyone for help. He simply stood, resolute, waiting for the right moment to act. The dog's owner, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, tried to pull the dog away once more, but the dog refused to listen. It was as if the animal was driven by some deep, primal instinct to challenge the guardsman. The situation was starting to feel like it was on the verge of getting completely out of hand. The owner was no longer even trying to maintain control with gentle commands. Instead, he was tugging on the leash, using all his strength to pull the dog away from the guardsman. But it was a losing battle. For a moment, it felt as though the street had fallen silent. All the people standing around seemed to be holding their breath, watching the scene unfold in front of them. The royal guardsman remained calm, but there was a visible strain in his posture now. The dog's relentless behavior was starting to take a toll, and the tension in the air was thick. Everyone waited for what would happen next, but the outcome felt uncertain. Would the dog finally calm down, or was this encounter only just beginning to escalate? The crowd stayed on edge, waiting for the next move. The tension in the air was now palpable. The dog, still pacing around the guardsman, was becoming more and more agitated. Its eyes were wide with frustration, and its muscles were tense. Every time the dog moved, the guardsman's gaze followed it, unblinking, steady. He wasn't going to break his composure, no matter how intense the situation became. The owner, by now completely overwhelmed, was tugging harder on the leash, trying to pull the dog back, but it was like the animal didn't even hear him anymore. It was as if the dog had become fixated on the guardsman, unable to let go of its aggression. "Come on, stop it," the owner shouted, his voice rising in panic. His fingers were slick with sweat as he gripped the leash tightly, his arms shaking with the effort. But the dog seemed to sense his weakness. The more the owner struggled, the more aggressive the dog became. It barked louder, its growls echoing through the street. People around them started to murmur, their phones raised to capture the moment, unsure of what they were witnessing. The guardsman, still standing in place, shifted his weight slightly to ensure he was ready for whatever the dog might do next. Despite the dog's increasing aggression, he remained calm and still, relying on his years of training. His expression was one of quiet determination, and his uniform, even in the chaos, remained perfectly neat. The dog's owner looked helpless as he continued to tug at the leash, but there was nothing he could do. The dog was too strong, and its focus was entirely on the guardsman now. For a moment, there was a brief pause in the dog's actions. It stopped circling and stood still, staring at the guardsman. The tension in the air seemed to grow thicker, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. The owner took a deep breath, his chest heaving as he tried to calm both himself and his dog. But just as he thought the situation might calm down, the dog let out a ferocious bark and lunged forward again, snapping its teeth in a display of raw power. The guardsman reacted quickly, stepping to the side just in time to avoid being hit. But the force of the dog's lunge was so powerful that it knocked into his arm, causing him to stumble slightly. His posture, usually so perfect, faltered for just a moment. The crowd gasped, and some even took a step back, unsure of what was happening. But the guardsman recovered almost immediately, standing tall once more. His face remained impassive, but it was clear that the dog's behavior was starting to take its toll on him. The dog's owner, now desperate, shouted louder, pulling on the leash with all his might. "Stop, please," he begged. But the dog was no longer listening. It seemed to be in a frenzy, its barking growing louder and more intense with each passing second. The owner was clearly exhausted from trying to control the dog, but it seemed like the animal had only become more agitated. As the dog barked and lunged, it began to show signs of exhaustion as well. Its breaths came in short, heavy gasps, but its aggression didn't stop. The guardsman, despite the pain from the earlier impacts, stayed focused. His eyes never wavered from the dog, even as it tried again and again to break his defenses. The bystanders, once amused by the unusual scene, were now growing anxious. They watched in silence, sensing that this encounter could soon go beyond anything they had anticipated. Would the guardsman remain standing? Would the dog's owner finally regain control? Or was this encounter about to take a much more dangerous turn? The questions hung in the air as the tension reached its peak. The situation had reached a critical point. The dog's relentless aggression showed no signs of letting up. Its heavy breathing filled the air, and its powerful muscles tensed with each step it took around the guardsman. The royal guardsman, though clearly under pressure, remained calm and composed. His stance was firm, and his eyes were unwavering, never straying from the dog's every movement. But even he couldn't ignore the growing pain in his body. Each time the dog lunged or knocked into him, it caused discomfort, and though he tried to hide it, the strain was becoming evident. The dog's owner, his panic now fully evident, was struggling with all his might to regain control. His hands were shaking, and his voice cracked as he shouted at the dog. "Enough. Come here." But the dog was no longer responding to him. It was as if it had locked onto the guardsman as its sole focus, driven by some primal instinct that was beyond its owner's control. The dog barked ferociously, its teeth flashing as it came within inches of the guardsman's body. The guardsman, despite the pain in his arms and legs from the repeated collisions, didn't move. His years of training allowed him to remain still, even under this immense pressure. But the force of the dog's aggressive movements was beginning to take its toll. The dog's sudden charge knocked him back once more, and this time, the impact was harder than before. For a brief moment, the guardsman stumbled, his feet sliding on the pavement as his body struggled to keep its balance. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones now lowered, as they saw the guardsman struggle. People began murmuring quietly, unsure if they should intervene. Some feared for the guardsman's safety, while others didn't know what could be done. The owner of the dog was still desperately trying to pull it back, but the dog's power was overwhelming. It was clear now that the situation was far from under control. The guardsman took a deep breath, his muscles tightening as he prepared for the next wave of aggression. He could feel the dog's presence getting closer, and his focus sharpened. But as the dog charged again, something happened that caught everyone off guard. The dog miscalculated, its paws slipping slightly as it lunged toward the guardsman. In that split second of hesitation, the guardsman moved swiftly, stepping to the side just enough to avoid the dog's full impact. But in doing so, the dog's momentum carried it forward with even more force than before. With a loud yelp, the dog slammed into the guardsman, knocking him off his feet. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through the guardsman's body as he hit the ground. His breath left him for a moment, his body aching from the sudden force. The crowd gasped in disbelief, many of them instinctively stepping back as the situation seemed to spiral out of control. The dog, still circling, looked poised to strike again, its growls deep and angry. The guardsman, now on the ground but not defeated, fought to regain his footing. His body ached, but he knew he couldn't afford to stay down. He pushed himself back up, his legs trembling slightly from the strain. The dog's owner, seeing the guardsman fall, was now in full panic mode. His voice grew louder, more desperate. "Please, stop. Help," he shouted at the crowd, but no one seemed to know what to do. As the dog once again approached, ready to lunge, the guardsman's focus remained unbroken. His eyes locked on the animal, his mind working fast. He knew that he couldn't allow the dog to get another strike in. He steadied himself, taking a deep breath and preparing for the next moment, knowing that the next few seconds could be critical. The crowd was silent now, all eyes on the royal guardsman as he faced the dog once more. What would happen next? Would he find a way to stop the dog's aggressive behavior, or was the situation beyond saving? The tension hung in the air as the story unfolded further. The situation had now reached a breaking point. The royal guardsman, despite all his training, was clearly struggling. His legs shook slightly, his breathing shallow, as he steadied himself against the force of the dog's attacks. The dog's owner, still frantic, continued to tug on the leash, but it was no use. The animal was out of control, and nothing the man did seemed to make a difference. Every time the dog lunged, the guardsman had to adjust, his body twisting and shifting with each new strike. The pain in his muscles was becoming unbearable, but he refused to show it. His focus remained sharp, his eyes never leaving the dog for even a second. The crowd around them had gone completely silent now, no longer cheering or talking among themselves. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how this strange and dangerous encounter would unfold. Some people were even holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The guardsman's face remained stoic, but there was an undeniable weariness in his posture now. The dog was relentless, its sharp teeth flashing as it continued to bark and growl, each sound filling the air with tension. For a moment, there was a brief pause. The dog stood still, panting heavily as it eyed the guardsman. It was as if it was trying to assess him, waiting for the next move. The owner took this moment to quickly catch his breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he muttered to himself, "Come on, calm down, calm down." But the dog didn't seem to hear him. Its focus was solely on the guardsman. And the longer it stood there, the more the tension in the air seemed to grow. The guardsman didn't make a move, but his eyes darted around quickly. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the situation pulling at his concentration. He had to remain still, calm, and controlled, but he was beginning to realize just how much this was taking out of him. His muscles ached with every shift in position, and his arms, which had been holding steady against the dog's attempts to knock him down, were growing weaker by the minute. Despite this, he refused to give in. He wasn't going to break, not in front of this crowd, not in front of the dog. The owner, desperate now, yanked the leash one more time, harder than ever. "Enough. Stop," he yelled, but the dog, ignoring its owner, began to growl even louder. The force of its bark rattled the air, and the guardsman flinched slightly. The dog, sensing the slightest hesitation, charged forward again. This time, it moved quicker, more determined than ever. The guardsman barely had time to react. In that split second, the guardsman managed to sidestep the dog, but not without consequence. The dog's powerful movements grazed against his side, sending a wave of pain through his ribs. He gasped, feeling a sharp sting, but he couldn't afford to slow down. The dog, unrelenting, circled back and tried again, its teeth bared. The guardsman's heart raced, but his body moved instinctively, his training kicking in. He sidestepped once more, his hands reaching out to try and push the dog back, but he was beginning to realize that this was a battle he couldn't win on sheer strength alone. The pain in his body, the exhaustion creeping in, made it harder to stay on his feet. He had to dig deep, find some reserve of strength that would allow him to keep going. The crowd stood there, as tense as ever, watching the struggle unfold before them. Every moment felt like it could be the last. the breaking point of a battle that no one had expected to happen. The guardsman's eyes remained sharp, never leaving the dog, even as the pain in his body intensified. He was determined not to let this moment be his defeat. The pressure was mounting with every passing second. The dog, now panting heavily and clearly frustrated, circled the royal guardsman once more, its sharp eyes never leaving him. Its growls were louder now, a deep, rumbling sound that made everyone in the crowd uneasy. The guardsman stood, his body aching from the previous impacts, but he remained steady. His uniform, once immaculate, was beginning to show signs of wear. The fabric pulled and stretched from the constant shifting and movements. He was trying to ignore the pain, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The dog's owner, meanwhile, was beside himself with worry. His hands were shaking as he gripped the leash, his face flushed with panic. "Please," he begged, his voice almost breaking. "Please, calm down." But the dog seemed completely unresponsive to its owner's pleas. It was as though it had forgotten everything around it except the royal guardsman. And every time the guardsman made even the slightest movement, the dog reacted with more aggression. The tension was now unbearable. The crowd, once curious and amused, had shifted into a state of nervous anticipation. No one knew what would happen next. Would the guardsman be able to regain control of the situation, or was he already at his breaking point? The tourists and bystanders watched closely, some whispering to each other, others unable to look away from the intense scene unfolding before them. The guardsman had yet to show any sign of weakness, but the weariness was starting to show in his body language. The dog, after a brief moment of stillness, suddenly lunged forward again. This time, its speed was faster, its movements more calculated. The guardsman, already anticipating the charge, stepped aside, but this time the dog didn't just swipe at him with its paws, it lunged directly for his leg. The impact was stronger than before, and the guardsman's body shifted slightly, a deep wince of pain crossing his face as the dog's teeth grazed his leg. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The guardsman's breath quickened as his mind raced. The pain in his leg was sharp, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. His focus remained on the dog, which was now circling him again, determined to strike once more. His hand instinctively reached down to check his position, ensuring he could move quickly if needed. The dog's growls continued to echo in the air, and its eyes glowed with frustration. The owner, seeing the dog's growing aggression, finally decided to act more decisively. With one last, desperate tug on the leash, he yanked the dog away from the guardsman. "No, stop it, please," he shouted, pulling harder than ever before. For a brief moment, the dog hesitated, its attention still locked on the guardsman. But now the owner had it under enough control that it stopped circling for a moment. The guardsman, breathing heavily now, took the opportunity to straighten up. His body was sore, and his legs were unsteady, but he held his ground. He could feel the pain in his leg where the dog had grazed him, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he focused on maintaining his posture, making sure that he wasn't giving in to the dog's aggression. The dog's owner was now trying to pull it away completely, but the dog wasn't making it easy. It whined, tugging against the leash as it still tried to get closer to the guardsman. For a brief moment, it looked as if the situation might spiral out of control again. The owner continued to pull, his frustration mounting with each passing second. The crowd watched in silence, everyone holding their breath, unsure of how this intense moment would end. The tension was unbearable, and it was clear that the royal guardsman was reaching his limit. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Could he hold his ground, or would the situation continue to escalate? The next moments would decide everything. The crowd was on edge, and the air was thick with anticipation. The royal guardsman stood there, his posture still firm, but his body showing the strain of the earlier attacks. His breath came in quick bursts, and his arms ached from the constant effort of trying to hold his ground against the dog's aggressive advances. The dog, now being pulled back by its owner, still seemed determined to go after the guardsman. Its growls were low but persistent, and it kept tugging at the leash, its body tense and ready to strike again. The owner, desperate and exhausted, pulled harder on the leash, his voice trembling as he begged, "Stop, please. You're making this worse." His hands were slick with sweat, and his face was pale from the sheer panic of the situation. The dog, for a brief moment, seemed to hesitate, its focus shifting from the guardsman to its owner. But the moment didn't last long. With a sharp tug, the dog broke free for a split second and lunged again, this time faster and more forceful than before. The royal guardsman, still standing tall, quickly sidestepped the attack. But this time the movement took more effort than before. His legs were heavy from the continuous shifting, and his arms felt like they could no longer hold the dog back. His body screamed for rest, but he couldn't let his guard down. The dog's owner, noticing the escalating situation, was now pulling the leash with all his might, trying to rein the dog in. But it was a losing battle. The dog was too powerful, and it was clear that the owner wasn't strong enough to control it in this state. The dog continued to bark loudly, its voice a mixture of frustration and anger. Its movements were erratic now, but it was still focused entirely on the guardsman. The guardsman could feel the tension in his own muscles as he prepared himself for the next move. He could see the dog's eyes burning with anger, and he knew that if the dog got too close again, it could be dangerous. But at the same time, he could sense that the animal was starting to wear down. Its movements were becoming slower, its breath heavier, and it was clear that it couldn't keep up this level of aggression for much longer. For a brief moment, the crowd held its collective breath as the guardsman and the dog faced off once more. The dog's owner, seeing the signs of exhaustion in the animal, finally gave one last, desperate pull on the leash. With a strained grunt, the dog stopped in its tracks, its chest rising and falling with every labored breath. The owner, exhausted and on the verge of tears, looked down at his dog, unsure of what to do next. His hands trembled as he held the leash, and he let out a long sigh of relief, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "Finally." The royal guardsman, though still standing strong, couldn't hide the exhaustion that was starting to show in his posture. His body ached from the constant struggle, but he wasn't about to let this moment defeat him. He knew he had to stay composed for just a little longer. Slowly, he straightened his back and adjusted his hat, trying to regain his focus. The dog's owner, now fully aware of the danger he had been in, took a step back and muttered a quiet apology to the guardsman. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do," he said, his voice shaky. The guardsman didn't respond with words, but his calm demeanor spoke volumes. He had endured the challenge without once breaking his composure, and now, as the dog finally stood still, he knew that the situation had been diffused, at least for the moment. The crowd, which had been holding its breath the entire time, finally exhaled in relief. People began to murmur among themselves, some still unsure of what had just happened, others quietly acknowledging the guardsman's incredible strength and resilience. The owner of the dog, his heart still racing, gently guided the dog away, trying to calm it with soft words and gentle pulls on the leash. The dog, still clearly agitated, trotted beside him, but its earlier fury seemed to have faded. The royal guardsman, though visibly exhausted, stood still for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the area. He had endured the chaos without allowing his duty to falter. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the guardsman remained at his post, his presence a reminder of the unshakable discipline that had kept him steady through the ordeal. The tension that had filled the air moments before began to fade, but the memory of the event lingered in everyone's mind. What had started as a simple day in the city had turned into an unexpected test of endurance, one that would be remembered for a long time to come. As the last of the tension began to lift from the air, the street slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The tourists, many of whom had been frozen in shock, started to talk among themselves, their voices a quiet murmur as they processed what had just happened. Some people were still holding their phones, unsure if they should share the moment they had just witnessed, but there was a shared sense of awe among the crowd. The royal guardsman, standing resolute and unshaken, had not only endured a sudden and intense challenge, but had done so with an unwavering calm that left everyone watching in awe. The dog, now quieter and less frantic, walked beside its owner, its pace slower than before. The owner, still looking a little shaken, kept his eyes down as he guided the dog away. He kept muttering soft apologies to the guardsman, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "I never thought it would get like this," he said, more to himself than anyone else. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly from the stress of the situation. He had never intended for things to spiral out of control the way they had. The dog, once full of energy and aggression, now seemed subdued, its earlier fury replaced by an odd calm. It was clear that the entire ordeal had drained both the animal and its owner. The royal guardsman, for his part, didn't seem fazed. His expression remained as calm and unreadable as ever. His posture, though slightly weary, remained dignified. He didn't acknowledge the dog's owner directly, choosing instead to maintain his role, as always. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon, scanning the surroundings with quiet precision, ensuring that no further disturbances would arise. It was a testament to his training and discipline that he could brush off such a chaotic encounter with nothing more than a shift in posture and a brief adjustment of his uniform. His commitment to his duty had been proven beyond a doubt, not just in his ability to stay still, but in how he handled the pressure when it came crashing down upon him. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some still glancing back at the guardsmen as they walked away. A few people, too, had taken note of the unusual calm with which he had faced the situation. There was a sense of respect in the air now, unspoken but clear. The tourists who had been filming and taking photos now lowered their devices, some even muttering amongst themselves about how amazing it was to witness such a display of control and strength. The guardsman, though, paid no attention to the praise. He stood there, as he always did, as if the world around him had little meaning beyond the task he had been given. But even as the crowd thinned and the street returned to normal, there was a sense of reverence left behind. People would remember the image of the guardsman, unwavering and still, as he faced down an unpredictable force of nature without ever breaking his calm. As for the dog's owner, he walked away with his dog at his side, now with a newfound respect for the power of the animal he had been struggling to control. He couldn't help but think of how close he had come to losing control completely. "I need to be more careful," he muttered under his breath, as he led the dog away from the scene. The royal guardsman, meanwhile, remained on his post, as he had before, blending once more into the background. He had faced a challenge, but it was clear that for him, this was just another day on duty. His attention shifted back to his surroundings, watching over the area with the same calm precision he had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. In the end, he had stood strong, showing the kind of composure and resolve that defined him as a symbol of duty and discipline. As the city slowly continued to move around him, the guardsman remained still, a silent protector in the heart of it all.